Greetings and very welcome back to my humble neck of the YouTube woods. We are gathered here today, guys, to try our best to kind of get one of these mush videos, mad mush videos into the mix. At least one this year, because things are going to get a bit hectic and chaotic in this neck of the woods. So yeah, it's just a light-hearted video discussing kind of an unpopular gaming opinion. And I'll just give one example, really. But what sparked this was, as you know, Resident Evil 9 Requiem recently released. Well, it's probably 2 or 3 weeks now at this stage. But I personally got it on the day of release and kind of ran amok on it for the guts of a week. Managed to get the platinum, which is always a nice bonus for Resident Evil games for me. It appears to be getting, for the most part, universal praise and recognition, and is breaking certain records and yada yada. I'm not overly interested in that, to be honest with you. I'm just kind of happy that it's a solid addition to the series overall, which I really think it is. Without going into too much detail, the most impressive thing for me was the fact that they managed to balance that kind of survival horror elements with Grace, and the action horror era with Leon. I thought they did that really well. I was quite skeptical that they could actually pull that off, but they did, and with a wee bit of style as well. And particularly when you're in the same areas and you're fighting the same enemies, so you can directly contrast Grace's experience with Leon's kind of action hero veteran experience, um so yeah, but I was watching a few friends stream Resident Evil 9 in recent weeks, mostly streaming, and if I was free, and I spotted it, I'd jump in, and we quickly realized, it dawned on me, that Leon probably is hands down the most popular protagonist in the series. You may disagree with me on that, but certainly he's in the overwhelming majority of people say top five or top three, say. Um, and that was very apparent how popular he actually is, with his kind of his pull power, shall we say, in Resident Evil 9. Some of which I found quite cringy. It was kind of ladies, foaming at the mouth for Leon Scott Kennedy. Some gentlemen too, I'm sure. Um, but it was kind of akin to Lady Dimitrescu and her three daughters kind of scenario, where you just had these people kind of drooling, essentially. Which could be quite humorous. Don't get me wrong. But also Leon is much more than a pretty pixelated face, isn't he? Yeah, he's a bona fide legend to the series. But I've always kind of preferred Chris a little bit more than Leon, and that's very much kind of evident that I'm in the minority on that opinion, because that would come up from time to time in one of these streams. And my thought process behind that is that Chris has kind of, it's messy. He's had ups and downs. He's been beat down and he's got back up, and he's been all around. And whereas Leon is a bit more squeaky clean, very rarely makes mistakes. He kind of evolved into a character that kind of shrugged things off and had a witty, punny comeback. Say, just gonna grab a quick sip of a cup on tea. And the old Stars Cup. It was actually accidental. It's one of three go-to cups that I tend to drift into. Yeah, I like that about Chris's character, that he had ups and downs and all arounds. Leon was much more kind of linear. He just became this kind of cool, um, witty character as the series evolved for the most part. I will say though, I was really impressed with Resident Evil 9, the way they did show that that jadedness And you could see that the past events really took their toll on Leon. You know, I think he's 49 years of age now at this stage. Um, so you could see that kind of build up on him, you know, and he had that kind of certainly survivor's guilt from surviving Raccoon City, and feeling helpless in the sense of not being able to help everybody that he could, and some people didn't pull through that were close to him, etc. That's really good. With Chris, um, oddly enough, I feel, you know, people kind of make fun of the amount of units that he's lost, the amount of people that he's lost when he was in command. However, I think the majority of those things were outside of his control. It wasn't due to terrible decision making or so on. It was more they come up wrong place, wrong time, a formidable antagonist type thing. And you know, like the Edonia incident, for example, when Finn and the unit was killed off, you could there's an argument to be made that Chris, you know, he gets a whopping smash on the back of his head type thing on that. Um, so he has physical and kind of emotional, mental trauma, and he has a bit of amnesia. So he's not really in his right mind when he makes the poor decisions on the latter part of Resident Evil 6, you know. I will say, however, I think I've mentioned it before, there's a few kind of unjustifiable things that Chris does, in my opinion. And, you know, the main outlier is the beginning of Resident Evil 5, when he allows that undercover agent to be executed publicly. When Sheva tries to step in and he stops her. You know, that just, that decision blows my mind. You know, if that was, even if that was an innocent civilian that he didn't know from Adam, he should have stepped in and tried to do the right thing, in my opinion. And if it was a BSAA agent that he had an affinity for, he's obviously going to step in and try and stop it as well. And as I said, directly after the execution, they get spotted and they have to fight everybody anyway. You know, not that that makes a difference, even if he had to just snuck by while the guy got executed. Still doesn't make it a great decision, in my opinion, you know. And the other thing is the fact that he went back to the old cancer sticks. You know, we all know in the original Resident Evil, the live action version of Chris was puffing away on a cigarette. Um, but I believe, you know, in my mind, it made much more sense that in the games that followed, um, he gave them up. He ditched it because he kind of went on a crusade against big pharmaceutical entities, big corporate entities, these big business, um, you know, these powers that be that are all about control and greed and manipulation and so on. And the fact that he went back on something that, you know, a product that has been released into the masses, and you know, causes mutations and lots of fatalities in the millions and billions and so on, just was a bit crazy to me, you know, because obviously in the game's narrative, he's against all these bioweapons and viruses and so on and so forth, and it's not too far afield from that, you know. Um, However, I've gone down a Resident Evil 9 rabbit hole or whirlpool, because that's not the game I wanted to talk about. Although, do feel free to let me know what you think of Resident Evil 9, whether you think it was good, bad, or middle of the road type title, you know. Overall, I was genuinely pleasantly surprised, and it's a very fun game to play. Because in order to get the platinum, I think I had to do 4, maybe 5 playthroughs of different styles. And ordinarily, I really don't like multiple playthroughs on games. But I really didn't mind with this because it was just so fun to go through, you know. And first time round, I couldn't put the controller down. I wanted to know more. All the Easter eggs and the nods to the 30 years of Resident Evil really kind of sucked me in nicely, you know. However, we're nearly 9.5 minutes into this, and I'm waffling away. So we shall direct it back to the series that I wanted to talk about, which is more Western orientated. Um, Not really my personal cup on tea. Forgive me. I was never a big fan of westerns. The whole rootin' tootin', you know, howdy y'all, shooting and pillaging and, you know, killing the natives element of it always kind of, you know, had me scratching my head. But you may have guessed we're going to talk about Red Dead Redemption. Um, and I suppose because Red Dead Redemption 2 is the prequel, we should start there really. Um, Phenomenal game. Like, despite me not really liking that era or time period, I mean, even from a animal rights, vegan centric point of view, the whole cowboy enslaving and slaughtering and consuming and treating the beautiful bovines as nothing more than resources and so on isn't exactly you know an overly nice prospect. Um, but nonetheless, these two games are brilliant. Particularly Red Dead Redemption 2 for me. They will be up there with some of the best games I've ever played. To be honest with you, I wasn't as crazy about the first game, which will make sense as I go, I suppose, with my poor take. But the second game I thought was brilliant. The game looks beautiful. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't overly gone on the actual gameplay, and the shooting and the combat and that type of stuff. But the narrative just sucked me in. The overall narrative was just brilliant. The dynamics between the characters and the camp, and the depth of each individual Vanderlyn gang member, I thought was just so impressive. And the individual relationships between them. And it was just fascinating seeing, I was about to say kind of it's the rise and fall of the Vanderlyn gang, but in reality, it's really just a fall, isn't it? It's kind of, by the time you come to them in the storyline, they're already in decline and in some pretty sticky situations, and it just kind of goes from bad to worse, and you see the kind of these cracks manifest and become more prominent, and eventually it all falls apart, you know. But each individual character, people have countless videos on Hosea and Dutch, of course, um, countless theories of what motivated them and what their actual values were and what they stood for, and did they have, was there something there, did they really care for the gang and the beliefs and the philosophies, or was it just all charlatan type scenarios, or did their ego and pride just get the better of them and so on, or paranoia, wherever the case may be. um, but I do remember back then that John was obviously a really popular character, and I remember people being a little bit disheartened that he wasn't going to be the main playable character in Red Dead Redemption 2, for example. Step in Arthur Morgan instead, who eventually did go on to become a extremely popular character in his own right, to be fair. Um, and I really liked Arthur's redemption arc in Red Dead Redemption 2, to be honest. And even from the early game elements where they were just teaching me the ropes and they had me going out and I had to hunt animals to progress the story maybe and bring stuff back to the camp. I wasn't sure if you had to do that or not at the time. And you'd be talking to that lady who would check in on your mental health from time to time, ask you how you're doing, and Arthur would be saying, I just keep killing animals. I don't know what's wrong with me. Why do I keep killing animals? Why am I so angry? That was kind of the beginnings of a bit of self reflection and change in my mind. He may even mention to the fact that they're vulnerable beings type thing. And of course, there was kind of photography missions where the guy would actively promote, not harming them. In actual fact, we should be protecting them, and if you are going to intervene, you should help rather than harm, and we should immortalize them in pictures and so on. And of course, you got the other end of the spectrum as well, where you had these crazy hunting minded people that just wanted to kill and do abhorrent things and turn everyone into inanimate objects to brag about, or whatever the case may be, to use and abuse. But I was impressed with that element nonetheless, because there is an awful lot of human centric philosophy going on in the background of the narrative, which was pretty cool too. Um, so yeah, I think Arthur Morgan's redemption arc, really begins with a bit of an existential crisis, doesn't it? He's facing his own mortality, essentially, one of the many kind of ill-willed or poor decisions that he made while he was with the gang was to attack um, a father, a husband who was sick with tuberculosis, TB, which at that point in time was incurable and was essentially a death sentence. And Arthur ends up contracting this from the blood that he has from beating this person up. And this kind of, starts as existential crisis. Now, I know as the player, you have certain freedoms to say how far that goes, just quite how benevolent he becomes. But generally speaking, I think it's accepted that he tries to be a more peaceful person and tries to do right by people. And he was an extremely loyal member of the gang, particularly to Dutch. He had Dutch on a pedestal. He looked at him as a father figure, somebody he looked up to and idolized and would die for. And that all starts to kind of fall apart a wee bit. And he starts to see the gang and see what they're doing in a slightly different light. And, overall, I'm very impressed with it, Like in the end, I know an awful lot of people talk about the horse passing away, and people get a bit teary-eyed at that I can understand. But, from the vegan lens, it's not that wholesome a relationship. He's might be out of necessity back then, don't get me wrong, but, he was kicking and beaten and basically ran this poor being into the ground and thanked them, like they had much of a choice. But for me, honestly, one of the saddest moments in gaming ever, and I've played a lot of games, is when Arthur looks up to Dutch at the end and says, "I gave you all I had. I did." And it leaves Dutch speechless. And at this stage, truth be told, I'm probably bawling my eyes out. It just hit so hard. It was just so poignant. And even thinking about it now almost gets me misty-eyed, because he really was. He really was so loyal and he loved Dutch, respected him. And to see, it go from that all the way through the trials and tribulations and everything that they'd been through was just so strong, So yeah, I suppose, I'll just throw in that I have no issue at all where John Marston's character in Red Dead Redemption 2. He's kind of straight out the gates. He's a bit, disenchanted with Dutch and the gang on the whole, is the impression I got. He already had a few falling outs, and he'd spoke his mind to Dutch, and the relationship wasn't phenomenal. And he's kind of, you feel like he's kind of on the fringes of wanting to leave or wanting to do something else. And of course, Arthur, as time goes on, puts a lot of faith in John. He really wants John to break away from the gang and, make a life for himself with Abigail and Jack. Now, the Abigail situation is interesting, because Dutch in Red Dead Redemption 1 actually brings to that. I think, albeit he says it in quite a callous way. He says, he mentions that John married Abigail, even though Abigail was a prostitute before or during she joined the gang at first. And it was well documented that she'd been with many gang members. And it was just unsure who Jack's biological father may be. And Dutch kind of mentions that, well, John, despite that fact, John married her, and that makes him a better man than us. Now, albeit it was a callous thing, if you want to shine that in a negative light, you can say, well, John was a fool, wasn't he? He was taken for a fool. Or if you want to shine a kind light on it, you can say, well, it's a very admirable act. It's a very noble act of him. So there wasn't an awful lot of controversial things for John's character, I think, in Red Dead Redemption 2 for me, personally. My issue is Red Dead Redemption, the original, which I did play and enjoyed. I played the Undead Nightmare too, which was really interesting DLC, that kind of alternate fantastical scenario. And probably played that as much as the original, to be honest. I wasn't as affected by the original as Red Dead Redemption 2, of course. Yeah. Oh, we'll pop this back on again anyway. rebellious PlayStation 5. But so yeah, I suppose with John, the main issue I have is it was quite clear to me that the Pinkertons and the government in Red Dead Redemption 1 were the main antagonists. I think that's very fair to say. Um, they kidnap his wife and kid and hold him for ransom, and basically try to force him to do their bidding, which is to hunt down his old former gang members. Yeah, if memory serves, it's Javier and Bill Williamson, I think, and eventually it kind of climaxes with Dutch, the former infamous, his former infamous leader. Um, and it's always so disappointing to me that John whether he just thinks that they're just too powerful, they're just too big, too strong, too powerful to ever take on. Never crosses his mind to try and rescue his family, or get away, or strike out against them. Instead, he essentially, for me, just becomes a lapdog for them, and he hunts down his old boyos selfishly. Now, you can understand it that he's trying to save his family, and it's a rather extreme circumstance, but nonetheless, it's a pretty shady thing to do, to be honest with you. Now, don't get me wrong, Javier and Bill, and indeed Dutch at this stage, they're still very much, not the most benevolent characters in the world. They're still very much criminals. Whether it was by, necessity or desperation, I'm not quite sure, but they're not the most kind or amazing characters in the world at this stage. But, your two options when you actually catch up with them is to bring them in alive and have them executed, or kill them and bring their corpse back. Now, if I'm making any mistakes, please feel free to let me know. I'm a wee bit rusty, more so on the original Red Dead Redemption than Red Dead 2. But that seems to be the gist of it, which which these people didn't wrong him in any way, shape, or form. They mightn't be the best people in the world, but he's actually just going out and, ending their lives, on the orders of a bigger, badder entity, really. And there's so many kind of funky, quotable lines, isn't there, in Red Dead Redemption 2? I think in Red Dead Redemption 2, I think Dutch says, this place ain't no such thing as civilized. It's man, so in love with greed, he has forgotten himself and found only appetites. Now, I probably got that wrong, but that is the gist of it. You get the sentiment, and I thought that was brilliant. The game is littered with really cool, quotable things like that. But I think the final interaction between Dutch and John in the original Red Dead Redemption is really cool. Like, it starts off quite jokingly where Dutch is saying, we have to stop running into each other like this. And I think he says, it's classic, I have a plan, John. And John says back, you always have a plan, Dutch. And he says, well, this is a good one. He goes on to talk about how you can't fight nature or time or gravity, and John tells him to just stop fighting then, and he says, well, I can't fight my own nature, it's a paradox, and so on. But I think the main thing that he says that's quite foreshadowing is he says, when I'm gone, they'll just find another monster. They have to justify their wages. I think that was incredibly apt, because we know what happens to John after this. And Dutch goes on to say our time has passed, and kind of flings himself to his death. But we know that the Pinkertons and the government, for a brief period of time, release John's family, but then they come, just like Dutch said, they come for another monster, and the monster is John this time, and John gets the exact same treatment as he gave his former brother in arms. They go there and they kill him in cold blood, and uncle, and probably would have killed Abigail and Jack too, truth be told, if they could. So yeah, it's that's the real disappointing thing, that I just didn't understand why nobody really questioned that. Why John was so popular, even though to me that was just such a conformist kind of, defeatist kind of attitude that he had towards that. Not once did he lash out against them and try and take them on and try and save his family that way. He just did their bidding, and then ended up getting the same treatment in the end. And I know Arthur put a lot of faith in John and that, but I kind of feel John did just conform for the most part rather than really embrace, a more peaceful way of being. There's no doubt, he came on a very, very long way in Red Dead Redemption 1, and he does do some genuinely decent things on occasion. Although a lot of it is just, stuff that he has to do in order to get what he wants, which is, his family back ultimately. But yeah, so that's my kind of controversial take on it. And even, I suppose, to a lesser extent, his relationship with Abigail. For me, Abigail is very critical of John. She's always kind of tearing him down and complaining about him and, ushering him to do this and to do that and so on and so forth, and which can be quite humorous. But I'm a bit egalitarian on these things, so to speak. So if it was the other way around and John was tearing into Abigail and attacking her kind of confidence and, ridiculing her and haranguing her to do something, I don't think it would be put in quite as humorous a light, So yeah, that is the gist of this light-hearted, pixelated video. I might actually make a poll just to keep things easy breezy, to be honest with you, and just have John and Arthur going head to head, because although John was immensely popular and still is, I feel Arthur has really earned a solid fan base, and he has a lot of respect himself, And just to reiterate, I am talking about the more, because I think if Arthur is more violent and aggressive and so on and so forth, you get that kind of wolf ending, more predatory kind of ending. Whereas I've always played it more towards the stag, the deer, which is to be as peaceful and as kind as possible near the end, a redemption effort, some may say. Well, yeah, so that's the gist of it. Feel free to let me know or respond to, maybe if you have a possible, interesting, unpopular, light-hearted gaming take, I shall love yous and leave yous. Make sure you look after yourselves and each other. Be kind to all kinds and slán a bhaile.